The following podcast was recorded February of 2017 and contains spoilers for the works of Kunihiko Ikuhara and other various anime. Due to amateur sound editing, mention of trains in space, and our guest questioning if he is a bear, listener discretion is advised. My name is Mary, spelled with an I, and joining me is my lovely husband and co-host Keith.
Hi.
And we are joined by our lovely guest, Jed.
Hello. So thank you guys for having me on. Like Mary said, I'm Jed. Jed A Blue is the name that goes on my books. I write about contemporary animation, both Western and anime. Currently have a book of collected essays on anime. My other major project is the Nerapocalypse of '09, which is a study of the DC animated universe in its kind of historical context of the 90s. And you can find that at my website, jedablue.com.
And you also have The Very Soil, your book about Madoka Magica.
Oh, yes.
Which I finished reading and thoroughly enjoyed.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, The Very Soil is my book on Madoka Magica, and that has been out a couple years now. You can find that on Amazon, Smashwords, BarnesandNoble.com, the usual places.
Okay. So, this episode we are going to talk about Kunihiko Ikuhara, the director of anime such as Revolutionary Girl Utena, Maruwaru Penguindrum, and Yurikuma Arashi. He also directed the second and third seasons of Sailor Moon R, and Sailor Moon S, as well as the Sailor Moon R movie. So even though he has been working in the anime industry for quite a few decades, he doesn't have that big of a body of work, but his work is very dense, as we will be discussing.
And I mean, there is a reason he does not have a big body of work. By all accounts, he is apparently a nightmare to work for.
And it's pretty much because he's a perfectionist, right?
Yep. Which, when you see how dense his stuff is, makes sense. Every little thing matters in his work, so it makes sense that he would be perfectionist about it.
Do we want to just start with something like Utena? Because I know that you have a lot to say about Utena.
The problem with Utena is, where do you even start with Utena?
Well, Utena, I think, is his most, popular. I think it was his most financially successful, if you don't count Sailor Moon, since that, that wasn't really, his baby, and Utena very much was his baby.
It might be worthwhile for us to start with the features that Utena shares with his other works.
So, lesbians.
Yes.
Well,
lesbians, rebelling against authority, all the important ones.
Well, if we want to just go down the list, I can pull up Ikuhara Bingo. Maybe it would be better to talk about things like the book that very obviously inspired parts of Utena, especially the elements of Apocalypse. You can remember the name of the book, probably.
Yes, Damien.
Can you go a little bit into that and how, because I didn't hear about this book until you told me about it, so.
Alright, so Damien is a book written in, I believe, 1919. It's a German novel about a boy named Emil and his growing up. And he has this friend named Damien, who is kind of not quite the bad boy, but by standards of late 19th, early 20th century Europe, he's the bad boy. So basically, it just kind of follows Emil as he grows up. He feels this tension between wanting to be quote unquote good, which is basically what his family and the church have taught him, and living according to his desires, which are not that clearly specified what they are, but let's just say that Emil and Damien are very shippable. Very, very shippable. So, as he grows up, Damien moves in and out of his life. He comes to learn that Damien follows this strange religion that's sort of vaguely Gnostic and worships a god named Abraxas, who is the creator of both good and evil and therefore higher than either. Like, the belief of this religion is that rather than following some external code of morality given to you by a religion, you need to be true to yourself. And there's a scene in there where Emil asks Damien, what about, rape, theft, murder? Aren't these things wrong? And Damien's response is basically, someone who is really true to themselves would feel no desire to do any of those things, because those are all about taking from other people and you wouldn't need anything. Then basically they are predicting this coming apocalyptic revolution that will tear down the old moral systems and free them. And the novel ends basically with World War I doing basically exactly that. It's a huge influence on Utena. Ikuhara, in the liner notes for one of the DVD releases, it has like little commentaries by him on every episode. And in episode 2, he talks at length about what an impact Damien had on him when he was a young man. There's a speech in the book about Abraxas. I'm actually going to pull it up right now, because if we're talking about Utena, we should talk about this speech. So this is a recurring quotation or statement about Abraxas. Emil first encounters it in a mysterious note, which then leads him to his second meeting with Damien and discovery of this whole religion. And it's, the bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. Who would be born must first destroy a world. The bird flies to God. That God's name is Abraxas. And this is not quite word-to-word match, but very close to the speech that the student council in Utena recites every time they go up their elevator.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just for extra emphasis, that God's name is Abraxas. If you look at the listing for the soundtrack CD, the organ music that plays during that scene is called That God's Name is Abraxas.
Okay. Yeah, that makes it a pretty undeniable reference.
Yeah. This whole concept of defying external rules, being true to who you are, and this idea of like an apocalyptic revolution as being a moment of liberation. That all ties in very strongly to Utena in particular, but like his work in general.
Yeah. I like the connection to the music because I feel like music is also very important in a lot of his works. I know that Utena has that very like distinct soundtrack, and I've seen it described online as like choir rock.
The name of the person who wrote those songs. Jed A. Caesar, spelled Seazer. His real name is Takaaki Terahara. I don't know how much credence to give it, but I have heard that Ikuhara basically heard that guy's music, said, okay, here's money, write this number of songs, and then just took those and matched them up to episodes.
So a lot of people are recommended Utena because they are told it is a deconstruction of the magical girl genre, which is not a great way to describe Utena.
It's really not. For one thing, it draws more heavily on fairy tales.
I would say that
shoujo in general.
Yeah,
but
I think of it as
girls.
shoujo in general, and falling under that are fairy tales, female adolescence, maho shoujo, which is a subgenre of shoujo. It's addressing shoujo as a whole and not just subsets as small as magical girl.
Now, that said, I think you can make a pretty good case that Akio is a direct reaction to Tuxedo Mask.
Then go ahead and state your case.
Basically, Tuxedo Mask, especially early in Sailor Moon, does a lot of stuff that is very romantic fairy tale prince, but actually kind of horrifying when you think about it, such as kissing Sailor Moon while she's unconscious, generally being kind of a stalker toward her, and eventually they start, they quote-unquote fall in love and start dating, but prior to that point, he's kind of awful, and, the age difference doesn't help.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone in Sailor Moon who's older than 12 is drawn like they're 25.
Yeah. There's this
which kind of obscures it a little.
There's this great episode, I don't remember which one, where, Venus is talking to a, kindergarten teacher. This woman is, in her 20s or 30s, and her and Venus have, the exact same body type, and then there's all of the, kindergartners that, maybe come up to their knees, and it's just, those are there's no in-between.
Right. And the same is true, really, in, Utena.
Yes.
But that's, art style.
And makes some of the sexual themes of Utena slightly easier to process.
Yes. Although it may also, to a degree, obscure how horrific some of it is.
Yes.
So you've got this, fairy tale prince behavior, which, when you think about it, is actually awful. And that's kind of what Akio/Dios as a figure represents. Akio is not the fallen Dios. We see in the last episode that, well, first of all, Dios is still around. He hasn't disappeared. He hasn't become Akio. They're both present because they're both the same person. Dios, the things Dios says to Utena when she's collapsed, he says them in a kindly way, and Akio says them in a cruel way, but they're the exact same things. You can't do this. You're not good enough. Give up. You've been chasing an illusion all along. The problem is not that there was this prince in the past and now there isn't anymore. The problem is that the very idea of the prince, that ideal, is corrupt.
Yeah.
And always has been.
Well, that might be directly caused by Tuxedo Mask in Sailor Moon. It very much doesn't feel specific to Sailor Moon.
Oh, no, that's definitely true. It's not so much targeting Sailor Moon as it is targeting the fairy tale attitudes that Sailor Moon is drawing on.
Obviously, a lot of things that Ikuhara says in interviews are not meant to be taken seriously, so I don't know if it has any weight to it, but I know that there are quotes of him talking about how he kept trying to kill off Tuxedo Mask, but obviously those ideas never got greenlit.
It wouldn't surprise me. And even if it's not true, the death of Akio in the movie is basically killing off Tuxedo Mask. I wouldn't say that what he says in interviews can't be taken seriously. I would say it can't always be taken at face value. I think most of the time there's something behind what he says, but it may take a little parsing. And then sometimes it's just straight up trolling.
Yeah. So I guess now I'm going to go on my little spiel. One of the reasons it bugs me so much for people to emphasize that Utena is all about the magical girl genre is the way people will argue and present that. They make it sound like Utena is the magical girl protagonist. The fact that she changes clothes as she ascends. I don't even think that equals the same sort of thing as a transformation in Sailor Moon, because when she reaches the top of the staircase, she is still Utena. She just has some shoulder pads on. She hasn't changed her identity at all. But the character that actually does go through an identity change and actually canonically is a literal magical girl is Anthe, because when she goes to the top of the staircase, she arrives as the Rose Bride, and of course we learn that she is also a witch, and she has to balance these identities of kind of good schoolgirl Anthe the witch, and the true Anthe. And that is just something that I think a lot of people skim over. By the end of the series, we know that Anthe is kind of the real heroine and real focus of the story.
That's very true. One of the points I like to make is that every duel ends with bells when the winner is decided. When a rose is swept off someone's chest, these bells start ringing. And in the last episode, the bells do not ring when Utena is stabbed in the back. They do not ring when she opens the coffin/gate. They do not ring when the arena is destroyed by swords. They ring when Anthe leaves Otori Academy.
Yeah.
Anthe is the winner of the duel that revolutionizes the world. Anthe is the one who actually causes this change.
The first time I watched Utena all the way through, I actually found that a little hard to adjust to, just because you go in with these expectations that, you know, the cute pink-haired girl that you're introduced to is the main character. There's no questioning that. And so
she even sits in the main character chair.
Yeah. And so Utena just is so good at deceiving your expectations on so many levels.
I was going to say, but that's part of the point. Utena herself makes the mistake of believing that she is the main character.
Yeah.
And that everyone else are secondary characters. And it's not until very nearly the end of the series that she realizes that Anthe is a main character too, that everybody is the main character of their own story, not supporting characters in Utena's story. I mean, that's a part of growing up, you know, where children can be very, very selfish. We don't even really start to comprehend that other people exist independently of us for a couple years into our lives. Some people don't seem to ever quite get it.
Yeah.
And so it's not that surprising that as part of her own process of growing up, Utena needs to realize that she's not the prince. She's not the main character of the story to whom everyone else is a supporting character. She's a main character of a story while other stories are going on around her.
So do we want to transition into the movie?
We can do that. I've barely scratched the surface of stuff to say about the TV series, but we can't sit here for a week.
So, do we have anything to talk about that isn't the car scene?
I already mentioned Akio's death. I mean, one of the biggest differences between the movie and the show is Toga.
Yes.
Toga is a very different character in the movie than he is in the show. The fact that they make him the boy who drowned from the story that Juri tells at the end of the series.
Yes.
It's a very interesting choice because I have a suspicion that I have no way of ever confirming unless I somehow manage to be in a room with Ikuhara and an interpreter and have given him some kind of truth serum so I know his answer won't be a troll. Because I know that the reason that Toga does not speak for the entire Black Rose arc is because the voice actor was unavailable. That's why they had him, like, broken down and staring at a phonograph, because the voice actor just wasn't there, so Toga couldn't have any lines, so they had him have a nervous breakdown. I have a suspicion, based on the way Toga was setting himself up to be the prince and all that kind of stuff, I'm not sure Akio was originally planned to be part of the show.
Really?
I think it's plausible Toga was originally going to take on aspects, at least, of that role. Because if you look at Akio, he sort of inherits a lot of stuff that's initially established with Toga. The cool guy who's a player, and all the girls want him, and he's got this creepy, incestuous relationship with his little sister, and he's manipulative, and can't be trusted, and betrays his friends, and, you know, I can go on.
Yeah.
And I mean, part of this could just be, oh, well, you know, Toga is deep inside Akio's clutches, essentially. Toga is probably the character that Akio has the most control over, even more so than Anthe, really. That's why Toga is Akio-like, is because Akio has influenced so much. But another possibility that I have entertained at times is that Toga essentially is Akio. In that light, the decision to have Toga be the failed prince in the movie is interesting. Because that's what Toga is in the movie, is he's the prince that failed. He tried to save someone. He drowned doing it. The idea of the prince is doomed to failure. And Toga is kind of the representative of that in that movie, because Akio's role is a lot smaller. I don't have any evidence other than what I just said. I have no idea if this is really a decision or if Akio was planned from way before they knew what the voice actor schedule would be. I have no idea. But it's an idea I've toyed with.
I guess that just because Ikuhara's works are usually so meticulously crafted, I would just assume it was planned out from the beginning. And if not, it doesn't feel like, oh, here's the part where, they fucked up and they had to fix it real quick and, because they didn't have this planned. So
I do know there are a couple places where there were fuck-ups. The first two Nanami focus episodes were originally planned to happen in the opposite order. The early parts of the series and Nanami's initial relationship with Utena makes a lot more sense if they're reversed.
Can you remind me what happens in those episodes?
The two episodes that were switched, I think it was something to do with animation difficulties or something like that. The two episodes that were switched it's not the first two Nanami episodes, it's episodes 6 and 8. Take Care, Miss Nanami, and Curried High Trip. Initially, Curried High Trip was supposed to happen before Take Care, Miss Nanami. And that actually makes some sense. It means that we go directly from the Sunlit Garden, watch Auntie during the studying scenes, and look at the little flip book she makes and giggles about. Auntie animates an elephant. If the episodes had happened in the planned order in the very next episode, Nanami would have been chased by elephants. Note that this scene is happening in the midst of Nanami's plot to make Auntie look bad. Also, the way Utena responds in the episodes. In Curried High Trip, Utena initially thinks that Toga is behind the weird stuff that's happening, because if this had happened earlier, she would not know the kind of ridiculous shenanigans that Nanami is prone to. Because Nanami's manipulations in For Whom the Rose Smiles and The Sunlit Garden are not revealed. Utena doesn't know about them. So it makes sense that she would initially think that Nanami is more or less innocent and Toga is the one that's causing the problems. And then in episode 6, somebody's threatening Nanami and Utena is really dismissive about it and asks, well, who have you screwed over lately? That makes more sense if Curried High Trip happened before it.
That is true.
It's the same liner notes where he talks about Demian. Mm-hmm. He mentions that there was some kind of screw-up that caused these two episodes to have to be aired in the opposite slots of where they were originally intended. It is a very meticulously planned and well put together series, but it's impossible to make anything as complex and massive and involving as many people as a television series without having some things go awry. The real masters are the people who can make it look like it was planned from the start.
I guess going back to the movie...
So, we basically want to talk about the car wash, right?
Yeah. I found this quote, which I think is really, really funny. So it's an Ikuhara quote, and it says, "Some of our fans took issue with the car wash scene. There were a lot of different opinions among the staff about this as well. There were many that definitely didn't want to do this scene. But I wanted to make the film special."
Yeah. One of the things I think regarding the movie is I think Ikuhara does better when there's someone able to hold him back a little bit. And so the fact that he had a little bit more free reign with the movie than he did with the series
meant that he could make it special.
Yes, meant that he could make it special.
I mean, there's a lot of people that turn into cars in this movie.
Yes, there are. The problem is that the movie itself gives no context for that. All the context for that is in the TV show.
Yeah.
Because when you put the two together, what you see is in the TV show, cars are constantly signifying adulthood, freedom, sex, which are all things that cars kind of signify in general life. The backseat of a car is often portrayed in many different movies as where someone's first sexual experience happens. If a date rape is shown in a movie or a TV show, there's a 90% chance it's going to happen in the backseat of a car. Getting a driver's license, you have to be a certain minimum age to do it, so it's one of the few rites of passage that modern cultures still have. If you have a car, you're not tied to where the train lines can go. You can go anywhere you want. And in the show, it's used for all these things. An expensive car can symbolize wealth and power. All these things are combined into what the cars represent. So at the end of the movie, when people are turning into cars, they are becoming sort of adults. They're becoming a particular understanding of adults. Because what happens in the show is that Akio uses the fact that cars are signifiers of all these things to tempt people. He basically offers them what looks like adulthood and freedom on a platter and uses that to control them. And so that's what's happening with like Shiori turning into a car and so on, is they're becoming adults, but they're becoming a specific kind of adult. They're becoming an adult that's under the control of someone else because they've bought into what they've been told. Because the thing about a car is the car isn't free. The car has a driver. So one of the things Ikuhara does is he will deliberately use a signifier to mean multiple things. Mm-hmm. He won't do what some filmmakers do, like, anyway, I'm blanking on his name, made Pacific Rim. But, like, he'll do a thing where he will pick particular objects or colors and reuse them in significant places throughout a movie. And at least within the context of that one movie, they have a specific meaning that is carried throughout. Ikuhara will set something up as having a specific meaning, and then 5 episodes later, or 45 minutes later in the movie, he'll use it to mean something completely different. Because any given signifier can attach to any number of signified. I was just listing out like all the different things that a car can be, and sometimes it'll be one, and sometimes it'll be the other. Sometimes it'll be all at once. Yeah. Depending on the context in which it's used. So Utena becoming a car is a little bit different. Well, first of all, there's the fact that we get the car wash, which is Utena basically being made clean. It's washing away all these things. Because remember, in the series, Utena had made the error of trying to be the prince, which is a bad thing to be, as we see with Akio. So this is kind of cleansing her so that she can be something else. It's so that she can become the vehicle by which Anthy leaves Otori. Because, like we said before, one of Utena's problems is that she sees herself as the main character and everybody else as supporting characters. Becoming a car and letting Anthy take control is Utena letting go of main characterhood. It's her saying, you know what? You take the wheel for a while. Let me be the vehicle by which you get out.
Literally.
Literally, because it's Ikuhara.
One of my favorite things that I noticed rewatching it is as they are driving away and then all their friends come to drive up and help them. If you look at the front of the vehicle that they are riding, it says Wakaba.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
Yeah.
Because one of the great things about Wakaba is that that's her from the start. She is aware that she's a supporting character in someone else's story. That's why she and Utena get along so well at the start, because that's exactly what Utena wants in a best friend, is somebody who'll treat Utena as the main character. Wakaba is aware that she is a supporting character in other people's stories, and that's part of what makes her so great, is her willingness to be that. It has its downsides, which we see in her Black Rose arc episodes. Yeah. Which are some of my favorite episodes of the entire series, the Wakaba ones. But at the same time, she knows that, she knows and accepts that that is who she is going to be and is willing to do that for others. She's willing to help other people. And so, yeah, I completely agree. I love that she's the car that the other characters ride at the end to come to the defense.
So I'm going to check how long it took between the movie for Ikuhara to make his next show. So the movie came out in 1999, and Penguindrum came out in 2011. So yeah, over 10 years before people were willing to work with him again. And then we get Penguindrum. Mm-hmm. Penguindrum is absolutely my least favorite of all the things he's done. It just didn't really resonate with me. There's a lot of really messed up things in a lot of Ikuhara's works, but I feel like Penguindrum has an extra dosage of that. Yeah.
Penguindrum has a lot of child abuse, incest, bad stuff.
Yeah.
Several attempted rapes.
Yeah.
One arguably successful, we don't really know for certain. It is, the only word I can think of is ugly. It is looking at some very ugly aspects of humanity. And it's not, we'll get to Yurikuma, I imagine, but, Yurikuma takes those ugly aspects and dresses them up very cutely. Penguindrum doesn't. These are recurring themes with Ikuhara.
Yeah, especially incest.
Especially incest. But child abuse as well.
Yeah.
Clearly, there's something that he has strong feelings about. One of the things that I notice about Penguindrum that's very different from Utena is that in Utena, the incest is consistently depicted as creepy and unhealthy. In Penguindrum, partially because the non-incestual relationships are so fucked up in that show, it almost feels like the incestuous attractions going on between characters are, no. Just no. Like, okay, I can definitely see how, in theory, an incestuous relationship could be less bad than the kind of horrific relationships characters have in Penguindrum, but, like, that's not because incest is in some way better. It's really, really not.
One of my biggest issues with Penguindrum is that I feel like it's really hard to read unless you have all of the context, and it's pulling very heavily from the siren gas attacks, knowing what those are, knowing when they happened, and kind of, knowing a lot about them. The show doesn't summarize or walk you through those. It just expects you to know what they are.
Right, which, to be fair, it's like complaining that an American show expects you to know what 9/11 is.
Yes.
Yeah. I was actually going to say a similar thing where it's curiously unique for Ikuhara's works in that it is one of those few things where it's a core concept of the show that isn't as universal as a lot of the other ones like lesbians and incest, where something like Utena or Yurikuma, all of the things are things that even Americans can sort of intuitively understand.
Well, the themes like fairy tales and just growing up, like, those are fairly universal.
Between the references to the siren attacks, the use of references to Night on the Galactic Railroad, which apparently in Japan is like a beloved children's classic.
Yes.
That the rest of the world has barely heard of. It's much more rooted in things that would be familiar to a Japanese audience, but not so much other audiences. So yeah, I agree with you, Keith.
Yeah, it pulls so heavily from Night on the Galactic Railroad, but I know that there's also scenes that specifically reference Haruki Murakami, which is another big name in Japanese literature. And I think that, at least for the average American, like, all of that goes over your head. I know that the grand majority of it went over my head when I first watched it, and I think that definitely affected how much I could appreciate it, but at the same time, I think a lot of other factors made Penguindrum very unpalatable for me. I feel like there's no real comic relief for me. It has the cute little penguins and it has them like kind of doing all these oddball things, but they're always doing that in the middle of really dramatic scenes. The quote filler episodes of Utena, even though Utena doesn't really have any filler, stuff like the curry episode or even just the shadow girls doing their thing, that made Utena's drama a lot better paced for me, and Penguindrum just kind of tries to do everything at once, and it doesn't give you a break.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with that. Also, Penguindrum has a lot more story threads going on at once.
Yeah.
Like, for all that it's quite semiotically dense, Utena really only has one central narrative. Penguindrum has like 50.
Yeah.
Like the way the series keeps relating itself to a railway map, calling episode stations and showing tracks shifting and that kind of thing, I think is actually...
Well, another issue that I had was that, it's so complex, but to me, I feel like we waste a lot of time in the beginning part of the series focusing on Ringo and watching her stalk people when we could be getting more information about all these other things going on. The first 6 or so episodes are very slow and drawn out for me, and then the rest of the series is just like overload.
Now, I watched the series at the rate of 1 or 2 episodes a week with a group of people, and a couple of people were definitely getting shocking swerve fatigue by the end. Like, you know, there had just been too many game-changing revelations to the point where it was like, well, I don't even care about these characters anymore because who they are could be dramatically altered in the space of a single episode. So why should I even care about them?
Absolutely. And I feel a little bad because we don't have anyone here to like defend Penguindrum.
Yeah, my friend Jennifer, she does convention panels. She's talked about Penguindrum both in a panel about Ikuhara and also a panel about penguins. And she really likes it and really topped it up before I had ever seen it. And it would be great if we could have gotten some of her views on it. Unfortunately, I can't remember any of what she said about it. But if you are ever at a convention in New England and see that Jennifer von Hoffman is giving a panel on penguins or Ikuhara or anything else that might have the show in it, go there and she'll give the defense.
I guess the only other thing I can think about with Penguindrum and that bothers me is that it's another one that grinds me when people try to sell it to you as a magical girl show purely because it has a transformation sequence that gets repeated over and over, which one transformation sequence a magical girl show does not make. That's another issue that I have with Ikuhara, where really Sailor Moon was the only like magical girl show he worked on. And you can see that influence. All of his works pull from Magical Girl. They pull from shoujo in general. And he's obviously, you know, using those sequences, you know, as a nod, but it doesn't make these shows automatically a part of that genre. So
I think you might be sort of like how Anthi is a magical girl, even though Utena is not a magical girl show.
Yeah.
I think you might be able to make a case. Even this would be, I think, difficult, but you might be able to make a case for Himari being a magical girl, but that does not make Penguindrum a magical girl show.
Yeah. Particularly
given that she's kind of the closest thing it has to a villain for much of it, until it settles on, what's his face?
Pink-haired ghost man.
Yeah, I took to referring to him as not Mikage.
That's pretty much what I think of him as. Well, the other things that Ikuhara took from working at Toei and working on Sailor Moon, he actually worked on shows before Sailor Moon, but they were shows that are older and no one really cares about them, and they're just kind of kids' Toei shows. One is called Maple Town, and it's like just about like an adorable family of bunnies talking to other families of bears and cute animals like that. But one of the things that Ikuhara obviously took from working at Toei was the idea that, you know, your anime always needs to have cute animals. It always needs to have a cute mascot. So that way it can be marketable. And we see that with Choo Choo and Utena, the penguins in Penguindrum, and pretty much all of the bears in Yurikuma. I don't even think he's trying to, like, subvert, like, the cuteness or anything like that. I think he just had it nailed into him. If you are going to make an anime, it needs to have cute animals in it. And so he just honestly puts these adorable animals into his shows.
They do serve roles, like the fact that their animals are significant.
Yes.
Like, Choo Choo is pretty clearly Auntie's familiar.
Yes, absolutely.
You know? And so part of the early evidence early in the show that she's a witch.
Yes.
And like you mentioned, the penguins kind of sometimes do stuff that points toward symbolism in various scenes.
They're supposed to, like, sort of serve that same purpose as the Shadow Girls in Utena, where they mimic what's going on in the show.
And I think they also are reflected, like each of them is associated with one of the three kids and kind of express aspects of that person's personality in a way that kind of resembles how Choo-Choo would sometimes serve that purpose for Auntie. And then I think the bears in Yurikuma, their cuteness itself is important to Yurikuma. I mean, if you think about bears, we often depict them as cute. There's a lot of bears in children's cartoons. There's teddy bears, so on and so forth. We tend to depict bears as these cute, fluffy, harmless things. But then when we encounter a bear, we're frightened and often respond violently. But in reality, the best way to deal with a bear is to just hold still. If you don't threaten it, it is very unlikely that it will do anything to harm you. So the best thing to do with it is just leave it alone. And I think that we're getting a direct analogy from that to the way that Yuri anime and manga depicts lesbians. That they're shown as being these cute, fluffy, harmless things when they're depicted, but when they're encountered in real life, in the larger Japanese culture, they're treated with fear and sometimes violence. But in reality, the best thing to do would be to just leave them be.
I think it's interesting that as, like, Ikuhara makes shows, they just keep getting shorter and shorter.
Well, I suspect finding people willing to work with him for more than 13 episodes is getting difficult at this point. He's apparently, like, a great guy to just kind of hang out with, but he's apparently got a very bad reputation as somebody to have as your boss.
My theory is that 10 years from now, when his next work comes out, like, it'll just be like 3 episodes. But Yurikuma, because it's so short, it's interesting because he has to take his style and condense it. Una and Penguindrum, when they start out semi-normal, where Una is the student that we are watching go to class, and we assume that this is a fairly normal school until proven otherwise. In Penguindrum, we assume that this is a fairly normal family, even though there are no parents, and then things start to get crazy. In Yurikuma, nothing starts normal, because it opens with this bizarre world where everyone is a girl and bears are the biggest threat to humanity.
And then everyone is a bear.
Well, the lesbians are bears.
Yeah, but, you know, by the end of the series, I'm starting to ask, am I a bear? You know? I mean, everyone in that series is a bear. Like, every character who is not a bear is secretly a bear. Which I think is part of the point. Again, if we do the bears equal lesbians thing, like, oh, they're not that different. You know, something that, this is actually coming from Jennifer Teague von Hoffman again, her comment on Yurikuma was that out of all of Ikuhara's works, it's the one that's weirdest up front.
Yes.
It's the one that's most in your face with, I am a very weird thing.
Yes.
It's the one that initially looks the most convoluted and bizarre.
Yes.
But it's actually the most straightforward thing he's done since Sailor Moon. I think one of the things you can make a case for going back to at least Utena and possibly Sailor Moon S is that one of kind of Ikuhara's running themes is this idea that, well, the prince, the model of masculinity, is corrupt from the start. Broken, flawed, terrible. Because it's all gotten much too wrapped up in power. And this is a concept from feminism. I am blanking on the woman's name, but she wrote a book called Gender and Power, in which she introduces the concept of hegemonic masculinity. And the idea is that we have defined masculinity in terms of power, that to be powerful is to be masculine, to lose power is to be emasculated, so on and so forth, with the result that, you know, masculinity is kind of possibly irretrievably wrapped up in these toxic power relationships. And I don't know if he's read that or not, but I think Ikuhara is playing with that where, okay, hegemonic masculinity has completely corrupted any relationship that has a man in it right from the start. So the only place where you can find true love anymore is lesbians.
I think Raywin Connell was the person who wrote the book.
Yes, it was Connell.
That actually reminds me of some of the research on BL that I'm doing, where a lot of the early BL was done in the male-male context in order to remove that state of gender dictating power.
That makes sense. That would be how BL would work. I think that's at least part of where Ikuhara's obsession with lesbians comes from. But I think that's part of why Yurikuma is so harshly critical of Yuri, is because Yuri is basically presenting lesbians for male consumption.
Yeah, and Yurikuma is interesting just because it takes that in a very, literal direction, where in order to have Yuri be acceptable, you have to take it and have it be judged by a group of men who need to officially approve it, and then you can go and have Yuri.
And even then, you're putting on a show for them.
Yes.
Because the transformation sequence equivalent, even more so than typical for magical transformation sequences, which tend to be pretty male-gazy to begin with, the Yurikuma sequences after they get approval are really male-gazy.
Well, and then after that you have the judges showing up in the human world, looking over things. Life Sex Seed is, literally just peeping on these schoolgirls that are getting busy, and, that's what he's focused on. He's not terribly focused on what is actually happening with the girls in their relationship. So I guess, do we want to talk about things that show up in all of his stuff? Lesbians and flowers are, at least his signature, if not, the defying ideas of his being.
The fact that he was working on Yurikuma and Penguindrum at around the same time caused him to sort of split his obsessions between them. So Yurikuma gets the lesbians and Penguindrum gets the incest. That's kind of the binary for him. Your options are incest and lesbians.
But a lot of that stuff even shows up in Sailor Moon. Obviously, Uranus and Neptune, the R movie, that entire thing is about flowers and how they represent a relationship with homosexual undertones. His signatures that are kind of only just peeping through in Sailor Moon get full-fledged, especially by the time you get to Yurikuma, just because I'm pretty sure that, there are flowers in almost, every single shot of that show.
Going back to the Demian novel, I feel like that paragraph that you read of you need to destroy a world in order to be born is very prominent throughout all the works. Perhaps it's not quite as prominent as in Utena, but there's definitely an element of it in Yurikuma where they effectively abandon that world.
Their world has a shell around it in multiple senses. There's the wall.
Yes.
But there's also that barrier in the story. That's the shell of the world that they have to break through.
Well, and in Yurikuma, there's less emphasis on destroying the world and more emphasis on destroying yourself, presumably as you were seen in that world.
He decisively seems to take destroying the world as changing your perspective rather than a literal destruction of the world.
I was going to say, although in Penguindrum, you've got some pretty literal destruction going on.
Yeah, because the world gets reset, so...
And the bombing
in
terrorist
Utena,
attack.
it's pretty literal as well, I get.
Yeah.
We've had multiple examples of him taking things very literally. But in Yurikuma, it isn't very literal, because either you read it as they leave that world behind to go be in the world of Kumeria-sama, or you read it as them dying and leaving the world. And that world still exists as it was, with all of its prejudice and the invisible storm, but the idea is that there is at least some hope that is left behind. And so even though it's not a literal destruction, it is a moving away from that world, which is very much what Anthe does, where, Otori Academy doesn't get destroyed, but Anthe manages to leave it.
And I feel like there is also this element of the reality that you cannot go back, where even in the cases where the world isn't literally destroyed, it's a world that you no longer belong to and can pretty much never go back even if you wanted to.
Well, and I think that just has to do with, like, human growth and how once you are able to fully, like, recognize and be aware of things like abusive relationships or just things that aren't good for you like that, then even though they're very hard to recognize and very hard to break out of, once you have successfully gotten away, then you probably won't try to go back anytime soon.
Well, and I think also there's a recurring theme, at least in Utena and Penguindrum, and thinking about it, the Sailor Moon R movie, maybe Yurikuma, but I can't really recall it showing up in Yurikuma, but there's a recurring theme of nostalgia as a trap in Ikuhara's work, that looking back and wanting to go back is very dangerous. There's several characters, like most obviously Mikage, but there's several characters in Utena who are trying to go back to the way things were, and the results are disasters. Like I said, Mikage, Miki, Saionji, they're all trying to return to some imagined better past, and it does not go well for them. You get that in Penguindrum, too. You've basically got a collision between multiple different characters who in multiple different ways are trying to go back to the way things were. And the results are consistently disastrous.
That sounds thoroughly anti-Japanese. Just because to be Japanese is sort of to be nostalgic.
Well, Ikuhara does seem to be pretty critical of his, the culture around himself. I mean, it does seem to be a recurring theme where this attempt to return to the way things were, and particularly an attempt to return to childhood, is repeatedly depicted as being very dangerous and destructive. With the Sailor Moon R movie, the villain's whole thing is trying to go back to the way things were between him and Tuxedo Mask, and it can't be done. Yurikuma is interesting, though, because in Yurikuma they do go back to the way things were, arguably. They just have to die in the process.
Night on the Galactic Railroad is a children's book that was written by Kenji Miyazawa, and it was published in 1934, and that's the year after he died. While he was alive, he virtually had no recognition as a writer, but after his death, his works became popular, and he is now one of the most famous authors and poets in Japanese literature. And Night on the Galactic Railroad is one of his most famous works, and it was adapted into an animated film in 1985. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at. The basic premise of the movie is that there's a young boy named Giovanni. He lives in a vaguely Italian town, and he has an ill mother. His father is off away somewhere, and Giovanni has to work in a print shop so that way his family can make ends meet. And he also gets terribly picked on and doesn't really have that many friends. The only friend he has is Campanella, who he knew since he was young, and there is a town festival going on where all the kids, including Campanella, are going to float lanterns down the river, but Giovanni has to go get milk for his sick mom and ends up kind of killing time on this grassy hill that overlooks the town. And then all of a sudden, a giant train comes out of nowhere. Giovanni finds himself on it with Campanella, and that is where we reach about the 40-minute mark of the film. It's called Night on the Galactic Railroad, but the train does not show up until 40 minutes in. And the rest of the film is these two boys basically looking out the window of the train, seeing these very strange things as they ride across the Milky Way and talking to many strange passengers who clearly are not from the same world as the two boys. And from this, there's lots of themes and discussions about self-sacrifice, what it means to be happy, and this relationship between Giovanni and Campanella. So the film is very slow-paced. It's also very quiet. There isn't a ton of dialogue. There isn't even that much standout music. And it's very dark visually. It's also fairly dark thematically, which we will talk about a little later. But there's not a lot of bright colors in this movie. It takes place mostly at night / in space. So the sky and a lot of the backgrounds are just black, but it is still a very beautifully hand-animated film. I really like the look of this film. It's not the kind of aesthetic that we're used to seeing in anime. The backgrounds all have this very, smooth look to their shading. I think that it, almost looks like an impressionist painting or something. Just very beautiful and very well crafted. And the imagery in the movie is very surreal. I think that that's kind of what is able to draw you in. So even though the atmosphere is very quiet and dreary, it's also very mysterious. And so that's one of the reasons that I like this movie, and I think that there's a lot for you to dig into the imagery and the symbolism. I have read the book, and I'm going to talk about how the movie differs from the book. It differs a decent amount. The biggest difference is that in the book, all of the characters are people. But in the movie, Giovanni and Campanella and everyone else are cats. Talking cats that walk on two legs and wear clothes. Giovanni is a blue cat and Campanella is a red cat. The other major differences are the things that they run into on the train ride. Pretty much towardsward the last third of the film or so, things differ from the book. The movie is split up into all of these segments that each have a title screen preceding each one. Some of these titles are taken directly from chapter titles, but other ones are just unique to the film. And pretty much all of these segments are at least partially based on some part of the book, with one exception, and that is the segment called The Blind Wireless Operator, where the boys talk to this blind man on the train who is working a radio, and that just never happens in the book. So the other thing is that some things get left out of the movie, presumably for time. It's a decently long movie. It's like an hour and 40 minutes. After this point in the movie where the train gets some new passengers who were in a shipwreck, and basically it's the boys and these passengers looking out the window, and they see wild peacocks. They see a man that is directing giant flocks of migrating birds. They see blast fishing, when you drop explosives into water to kill fish so that way you can harvest them up. They see specifically a Native American from Colorado who is hunting a bird, and they see these twin crystal palaces, and none of those come up in the movie. I don't really feel like it takes away from the movie. I don't really feel like when you'd watch the movie you feel like these segments are missing. If you hadn't read the book, you wouldn't even know that they weren't there. Another really curious thing that the movie did not leave out, but instead extended, was a part that is literally a sentence where the train speeds by a boy that is standing by a small house, and it's just this one sentence in the book, and it's this entire moment in the movie where kind of the train almost slows down and it zooms in on the boy standing at this house in the countryside. Characters talk about it, and so they extended this one scene for whatever reason. And, of course, there are, like, very small differences that don't even matter. Like, Campanella helps a passenger with one of his bags at one point, and, like, that doesn't happen in the book, but, like, it doesn't actually matter. The book is very short, so you can read it for yourself. You can buy it. You can find it for free online. You can probably finish the book in one sitting, because it's a children's book, so it's pretty short. Now I'm going to kind of make my argument for why I think people should watch this movie. It is very slow, but I do think that the visuals are very beautiful, and I think that it's a very thoughtful story just because it poses a lot of big questions, and it's also a very sad story, but that doesn't really take away from its value. It'll help you get familiar with Kenji Miyazawa, who's really important in Japanese literature, and by extension, Japanese media as a whole. Like, his influence can easily be found in anime. The biggest one probably being Galaxy Express from Leiji Matsumoto, where it's about traveling through the stars via trains, and that is very much something that has been attributed to being inspired by Night on the Galactic Railroad. But kind of more relevant to what we have been talking about is obviously the works of Ikuhara, especially Penguindrum, where it just flat out references it. But I think that a lot of the themes you can see across all of his works. If you like anything by Ikuhara, especially if you like Penguindrum or Utena, and even Yurikuma, but like I think particularly Penguindrum and Utena, then I think it's really important to see the film Night on Galactic Railroad, because you are going to see where those influences came from, and I think that it's going to help make those series make more sense, just because you can get an idea of what Ikuhara is trying to reference and provoke with all of the imagery that he borrows. So yeah, do you feel like watching it was worth it, Jed?
Well, before we started recording, I referred to it as a vortex of boredom. I do feel like it sapped significant quantities of my life force. I don't know, honestly. I just feel like, particularly the first half hour to an hour of the movie is really slow. And all the interesting stuff that influenced Ikuhara seems to have happened in the last half hour. I don't know. It was a bizarre experience. I honestly don't think I could recommend it to people. I'm not saying that, like, it is bad and no one should watch it, but I don't think it's something that I could enthusiastically go up to people and say, you need to watch this movie.
Keith, do you have feelings?
As much as I want to heartily defend it, I do recall the first time I tried to watch it, I fell asleep.
I was going to bring that up, and then because you always argue that you didn't, and are you finally admitting that you did?
I mean, the reality of the matter is that I was sort of more in and out. But it was definitely a close call, which makes it a little bit hard for me to argue for the engagingness of the movie. I will say it is interesting to look at. You need to be very prepared and very awake in order to watch it, but it definitely has very interesting visuals.
It is very atmospheric.
Yes.
It does a very good job of being just a little bit ominous and creepy while depicting basically ordinary life for the first half hour. Like, it makes you feel something is going to happen. The downside of this is that about 35 minutes into the movie, I said, oh, thank God something happened. This is not a movie that you watch for things happening. This is a movie that you watch for
waiting
visuals. Treat it less as a story and more as a trip to an art gallery, and it might work better.
That feels relatively apt, yeah.
Because even by the standards of, plot without conflict, it's, in that style of film, which, we've seen a few of those from Japan, even by those standards, there's not a lot going on for most of this movie. There's a lot of blank staring at the camera.
So,
long shots of blank staring at the camera.
In regard to that, that is arguably a flaw in the adaptation where Giovanni actually has inner monologue for a lot of the book, and for the movie, for the most part, they just took out his narration, and so it's just him blankly staring. But I am going to attempt to defend that, because I think that we've also seen a lot of anime where it gets too bogged down in the narration, and we're too dependent on having it tell instead of show, and so I like how we have to guess what Giovanni is thinking instead of it just being handed to us. That is better than them just taking all the narration from the book and just laying it on top.
I see where you're coming from. The problem I have is between the fact that he shows no facial expression for most of the movie and the fact that he just sort of... You can show facial expression on cats in a cartoon, okay? But between that and the fact that he just sort of accepts everything that happens without questioning any of it, I don't find myself guessing what he's thinking so much as being like, well, clearly this is someone who has nothing going on. Like, there's no indicator of any kind of thought or feeling happening inside this character for most of the movie. There are scenes of characters just kind of blankly staring at stuff in other works where I would 100% agree with you. The infamous elevator scene in Evangelion comes to mind.
Oh, that's not a good example.
I think that's a great example, because I think there's a ton going on in those characters' heads, and you can figure out what all of it is. Whereas here...
Just watching the series, or...
Yeah. Like, in that moment, you know what they're feeling.
Do I?
Where I felt that I did. Maybe put it that way.
Okay.
Whereas I feel like I have, for most of the movie, no handle on Giovanni because I haven't been given anything. Because he's so passive is the word I've been looking for. He's such a passive character that I don't feel like I have, in those scenes, any ground on which to even make a guess. It would be one thing if we got stuff early on to give us a feel for who he is as a character, and then they gave us these blank stares. But
I mean, I guess, like, what they give just... I mean, you're saying, like, isn't enough, because we know that Campanella is pretty much his only friend, and that what he's leaving behind to go on this adventure with him isn't very much, and we know that he's this really hard worker, but it doesn't really pay off very much. So I would say that, like, you're arguing that it just doesn't give you enough.
Yeah. For me, at least, it just felt like I did not have enough of a grip on this character to get a feel for what he was thinking or feeling in response to the incredibly bizarre things that were going on around him.
I mean, and I think part of that is because, like, it's supposed to be somewhat unsettling that all these bizarre things are happening and they aren't questioning it. But also I think it's because he's following Campanella's lead, where there's a reason that everybody else on the train besides Giovanni is not very startled by what's going on. But I guess that it would make sense for Giovanni to be a little bit startled. But I think that it's like what you said, where he doesn't have a lot going on. So I think that he is ready to just take whatever happens.
And that's fair. It just makes for a rather boring movie. I mean, as it got toward the end and he started showing signs of having feelings about things, the movie gets a lot more interesting.
And that's where it starts differing more from the book. That's where they take out a lot of the things of them just looking out at the window at strange things, and when they give the boys something to, like, play off of, it starts becoming more and more apparent where the train is taking them.
And maybe that's the problem, is maybe up until that point it's being excessively faithful. It's, not taking into account that things which work in one medium won't necessarily work if you translate them faithfully into another medium.
And that first 40 minutes before the train shows up, like, that is just going through each individual chapter of the book. Like, all of the titles, I think for the most part, maybe not like every single one, but for the most part, each of the titles of each of those segments are the names of the book chapters.
Yeah. So that would make some sense. And that's a recurring issue with adaptations of really beloved books, is a lot of them are harmed by being too faithful and by failing to take into account that things don't necessarily translate across media.
But I think also, like, one of the strengths of the story being told more visually is that you get an actual reference image for what they're seeing. Because in the book, you just kind of have to, like there's this really weird line that is not in the movie where they see an electric squirrel, and it's just like, and then there were trees, and then there was an electric squirrel in the trees, and then it just keeps going. And it's obvious that, it's just kind of this very, fun, imaginative pairings of adjectives and nouns, but maybe not so much since this is a story from Japan and electric squirrels are everywhere. But I really like how in the movie they give you images that I think work better in the book. They take the images from the book and then make them work even better in the movie. There's a part in the beginning when Giovanni is going up the hill where he's gonna go lay down, and there's a crow, and in the book, this crow just kind of, flies over his head, but in the movie it's very, menacing, and it kind of takes up the sky and, swallows the sky into black for a second and then flies over his head. And so I think even with those parts where they're being very faithful, they are managing to, add to it and make it a little bit more interesting. Yeah, and I will say that crow is one of the few things that kind of caught my eye, and I was like, oh, that's neat, in the first half of the movie. Because it is a neat shot, and a neat moment. And it does convey some real, dread. So this is a scene that I want to talk about. What did you think of the part where they, the train stops, they get off, they go down the giant flight of stairs, meet the archaeologist, and then go back up? Did you have any feelings on that scene, or? That was a interesting sequence. The thing that jumped out at me was the archaeologist saying that different people experienced it differently. Kind of sets us up for what's happening in the rest of the movie, for us to keep in mind that experiences may differ. And I think it's foreshadowing near the end of the movie when Campanella sees a field that Giovanni does not. Other than that, it seems to be tying back to the fact that his father brings back fossils sometimes from whatever it is that he does. That was about all the thought I had on that sequence. I liked the sequence when I first saw the movie, before I read the book. Specifically, the part where they go down that giant flight of stairs and take the walnuts back with them. That is not in the book. They get off the train, they go to, directly to this weird beach, and he's a geologist in the book, and so they talk to him. And pretty much everything he says is the same. But the giant staircase that they have to descend in the darkness and kind of like lose your sense of time because they're like, oh, we have to go, but then obviously like it takes a long time to climb all those stairs. And so kind of time and space are obviously like being warped during their time on this staircase, and I think that is where Ikuhara gets his fetish for stairs. Because
that's quite possible.
There are stairs in all of his stuff, even Sailor Moon. Like, there are these, like, ominous stairs that you gotta, like, either run up or run down, and, like, you aren't sure, like, there's a lot of, like, time, manipulation where, like, you aren't really sure how long it's taking to go up and down the stairs. A lot of the stairs are in the minds of the characters. So I think that that scene, which does not happen in the last 30 minutes of the movie, is very influential, at least in Ikuhara's works.
I think that makes sense. I mean, one of the things the movie is playing with, and which Ikuhara also frequently plays with, is this notion of liminality. Yes. This notion of in-between spaces. And stairs are, you know, they are a liminal space. They are something that connects to other places, not somewhere you go for its own sake. Trains are also liminal spaces. Any form, you know, train tracks. And one of the things about liminality is that it can, traditionally in stories and so forth, liminal spaces can connect the living and the dead. You're much more likely to encounter ghosts in hallways or staircases or that kind of thing than in your bedroom. And that's, I think, part of what's going on here is that Ikuhara plays with stairs. I think very often what he's playing with is their liminality. He uses them as things that can connect two worlds. So, for example, in Utena, you get the stairs that connect the relatively ordinary, by standards of Utena, Otori Academy, to the bizarre world of the dueling arena and the castle in the sky. Or in, not in the Galactic Railroad, like you were saying, the stairs are used as a connection between the present and the deep past. So that would make sense to me. That's plausible as a source film.
A piece of the shadow and the light that I have kept until now are, as you see, a mental sketch.
So I really like the movie. I think other people should see the movie if they have any interest in Japanese literature or, like, the works of Ikuhara. But, I mean, I don't really think it's, like, the best, like, general family film. Even though that's kind of what it's supposed to be. But yeah, I like it a lot, and I would recommend it to anybody who is curious to see the source of that influence.
If you're going to watch it when you're wide awake and it's the end of the day. Because if you watch it first thing in the morning, you will accomplish nothing that day because you will be asleep. And if you watch it while at all sleepy, you will not make it to the interesting parts of the movie.
Yeah. I decisively agree.
So on that note, do we have anything else as parting remarks? Do you want to go over your plugs again?
Sure. So if you want to find more of me for some reason, I've got a book out on Madoka Magica called The Very Soil. It is not, to my knowledge, carried in any bookstores, but they're all capable of ordering it if you ask them. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Smashwords, CreateSpace, all the kind of usual places you might go to buy books. I have a book on anime called Animated Discussions, which is essays on a number of different anime, including quite a bit of Utena, because I like talking about Utena, coming out hopefully end of March, beginning of April. So keep an eye out for that. You can find me at jedablue.com is my website. where mostly I blog and vlog about contemporary animation, by which I mean anything from the late 80s to now. And yeah, that's about it.
All right. Thank you very much for being our first guest, and
Well, thank you for having me.
And I guess we'll end it there.